Vine Street is a small dead end in Westminster with a dark past. Located between Piccadilly and Regent Street, Vine Street was home to Vine Street Police Station, a major police station and one of the busiest in the world. It closed in 1940, but was reopened in 1966. It finally closed for good in 1997 and was demolished a few years later. Vine Street's links to police and law date back to the 1750s, when a courthouse was built at the western end of the street. In 1767, a watch house was located on Vine Street, containing a watchman's room for a constable of the night. Located in the basement were 2 cells. Once the Metropolitan Police was established in 1829, the watch house became officially known as Vine Street Police Station and rapidly became one of the main stations in London. In 1895, the Marquess of Queensberry was charged at Vine Street for criminal libel against Oscar Wilde. This led to a series of events, with Wilde eventually being arrested, charged and imprisoned. Reports the building might be haunted began to circulate in the early 20th century. Heavy pounding footsteps, as though someone is pacing up and down anxiously, were heard from deserted corridors and locked vacant cells. One office seemed to be particularly active, with documents and official paperwork found strewn and disarranged as though someone had been frantically reading them or looking for something. On many occasions this happened overnight when there was nobody present at the station and the office was locked. Staff were truly terrified by events at Vine Street, to the point where staff would quit and refuse to come back. Cells apparently opened by themselves during the night. In 1969, a senior police detective stated that he'd been scared twice when he experienced the unmistakable presence of someone else in the office when he was actually there alone. Afraid he'd be ridiculed by his fellow police officers, he didn't create an official report, but subsequently refused to go into the office on his own. Another police officer ran from the building after hearing pounding footsteps heading towards him in an empty corridor. As soon as he moved to run out, the footsteps stopped. So what could be the reason for these ghostly events? Could the sounds be attributed to outdoor noises or even the London Underground? Possibly. Could it be that, given its history as one of the oldest police stations in London, staff had a preconceived idea that it might be haunted? We will never really know. However, there are 2 documented events that could shed some light as to who this alleged spirit may be. In 1928, there was public shock when it was announced that Police Sergeant George Goddard, based at Vine Street Station, had been receiving bribes from a nightclub owner, Kate Merrick, owner of the 43 Club, a nightclub in London that became notorious during the Jazz Age for outrageous parties frequented by the decadent, rich and famous. He acquired the equivalent today of over £1 million. This was front-page news and did much damage to the reputation of the police. He was sacked, charged with conspiracy and accepting bribes in connection with a nightclub. His punishment? He was imprisoned for roughly 18 months for his crime. Could he be returning to the place where he once had a spotless reputation? Perhaps more plausible is the next case. In August 1853, Edward Beck, aged 37, was found wandering the streets of the St James's area of London, drunk at 3 a.m. on a Sunday morning. A police officer took him into custody as a suspected person, and he was placed in a cell at Vine Street. At 5 p.m. on the same day, the officer took some water to the prisoner and found him unresponsive. He had opened the cell and found Edward Beck sat on the floor with a fatal cut to his left wrist. Beck had managed to wrench an iron tip from the heel of his boot and utilised this to slash his wrist, and subsequently bled to death. Could his restless soul be responsible for the unexplained events that occurred at Vine Street Police Station? As the Metropolitan Police expanded in size and coverage of London, its headquarters, referred to as New Scotland Yard, changed location several times. In 1890, the police force moved to a new building situated on the Victoria Embankment, overlooking the Thames, from their original premises in Whitehall Place. The force had grown from 1,000 officers to 13,000 officers. Designed by architects Norman Shaw and John Dixon, between 1887 and 1906, the buildings were home to the police force until 1967, when the police moved again to number 10 Broadway. The building has a distinct look and was built with red brick, Portland stone and granite. The granite used was mostly quarried by convicts at Dartmoor Prison. The building also contained a museum collection of crime relics known as the Black Museum. On the 11th of September 1888, a human right arm and shoulder were spotted on the banks of the Thames at Pimlico. A few weeks later, during the building's construction in October 1888, a construction worker made a surprising discovery. Built on a set of vaults, soon to become the cellar, Mr. Fred Widborn discovered a bundle wrapped up in black cloth and tied up with string. The gruesome parcel contained a female torso. It was quickly deduced that the torso could only have been placed there after the 29th of September, as that was the last date the vault had been unlocked. Dr. Thomas Bond, the surgeon of the Metropolitan Police's A Division, identified that the woman had been roughly 5'9" in height and was well nourished when alive. Bond matched the torso to the arm and shoulder from Pimlico, and the police began to search for the head and remaining limbs. Whilst a left leg cut above the knee was located near the construction site, a head was never discovered and the victim never identified. Speculation that the body was linked to the crimes of Jack the Ripper was dismissed by the Metropolitan Police, and the case, commonly referred to as the Whitehall Mystery, is still unsolved. Since the building opened, staff have reported several unusual sightings, particularly in the museum location. The museum contained a collection of death masks from prisoners hanged at Newgate, as well as other grisly items from modern killers such as the rolling pin used by murderer Ronald True, as well as the gas mask and gloves worn by John George Haigh when he was destroying his victims. In the 1970s, a caretaker for the building reported the sighting of a female figure standing next to the door of the museum. She reportedly proceeded to open the door. Still in shock, he moved forward to try and apprehend the figure. Wearing what he described as a nun's habit, as he approached her, she disappeared. He turned around and found she was looking at him from the opposite end of the museum. She was facing him, but he noted with alarming detail that her hood was empty. She was a headless apparition. Mr. Jerry Dawson, who became the museum's curator in 1957, reported that he had witnessed the dark figure in the museum a number of times, but it always vanished as he approached it. He speculated that it could have been his eyes playing tricks on him, although he noted that the figure had been seen in several locations within the museum itself. Sadly, Mr. Dawson died in 1970 on his way to the museum. The Norman Shaw building is now a Grade 1 listed building. When the Metropolitan Police moved to their new premises, the museum accompanied it, but sadly, it is no longer on show to the public. The Old Bailey Central Criminal Court stands on what was the site of the notorious Newgate Prison. Renowned for its horrific conditions, cruel treatment by guards and unsanitary cells, it's said the floors crunched when walked on due to the lice and dead bugs. Commissioned in the 12th century by King Henry II, Newgate Prison remained in use until 1902 and was finally demolished in 1904. In the 18th century, the number of capital offences grew to around 200, many of them relating to property. It was a capital crime to cut down a cherry tree in an orchard. Newgate became renowned for the sheer number of executions that happened either publicly or behind prison walls. Many of those sentenced to death were hanged in groups, with men and women together. On February the 2nd, 1785, 20 prisoners were hanged in one day. Between 1783 and 1902, a total of 1,169 prisoners were hanged. One of Newgate's most notable inmates was serial killer and baby farmer Amelia Dyer. Trained as a nurse, Amelia Dyer turned to baby farming to make additional money. During Victorian times, it was socially scandalous to be an unwed mother, so many women placed their baby in the care of strangers who would adopt the infant and promise it a good life in exchange for money. Amelia Dyer did this for over 30 years, initially caring for the infants, but eventually murdering the children by starving, strangling, and poisoning them. In March 1896, a bargeman named Charles Humphreys noticed a suspicious package floating in the River Thames at Caversham Lock. He fished out the object, and it turned out to be a brown paper parcel tied up with string. Inside was a brick and the body of a baby wrapped in newspaper and with a cord tightly tied around its neck. Using an address on one of the pieces of paper wrapped around a baby's corpse, detectives were able to trace the packaging to Amelia Dyer. In a highly publicised case, Dyer was arrested for the murders of 3 children and was sent for trial at the Old Bailey, where she was found guilty and sentenced to hang. According to the press, she smiled in court when witnesses related the stories of her terrible cruelty. On the 10th of June 1896, she took her final steps along Dead Man's Walk. As she went to the gallows, Dyer abruptly stopped, turned to the chief prison warder, Mr. Scott, fixed her gaze on his, smiled her toothless smile, and sneered the words, "I'll meet you again someday, sir." Seconds later, her lifeless body was dangling at the end of the hangman's noose. The police investigated Dyer's actions after her death, and it soon became apparent that Dyer may have been responsible for up to 400 infant deaths. Years passed, and Mr. Scott progressed in his career in the prison service. As the prison prepared to close for the final time, female convicts were moved to Pentonville to continue their sentences. In the last week of Newgate Prison's operation, the chief prison warder, Mr. Scott, was working alone in the vicinity of the women's yard, where he reported an unusual event. He had the distinct feeling he was being watched. He said he thought he'd seen someone moving around in the darkness outside. He peered through the observation window and saw the figure of a woman emerging from the darkness with distinct facial features. He had no doubt it was the face of Amelia Dyer. At the very same moment, he remembered what Dyer had said to him before her execution. "I'll meet you again one day, sir." Could he have been hallucinating? He agreed that he could have been unconsciously thinking about the execution 6 years earlier as she went to the gallows. However, other prison warders and staff had also witnessed the dark form of an elderly female in the same location in the dead of night when there were no female prisoners at Newgate.